Welcome to today's LaRouche Organization show for Saturday, July 15th. Post-Vilnius, with NATO's demise, will the world turn toward peace? As the reviews begin to come in after the NATO summit conference in Vilnius, the magnitude of its failure has surprised even NATO country commentators. What came out of the NATO summit in Vilnius was pathetic and dangerous. The conclusions of this summit are dangerous also because in the verbose and unintelligible text, 11,256 words full of ideology, prejudice, and lies of the final document, other countries are beginning listed in addition to Russia and Belarus, far outside the zone of North Atlantic interests, which could jeopardize not only peace, but also democracy in the kingdom of good, that is, in the West, said Alberto Brandanini, a former Italian ambassador to Tehran and Beijing. If peace were the focal point of the discussion in Vilnius, we would have had a compromise proposal to work on, not an insistent demand to withdraw Russian troops from Ukrainian territories, which is tantamount to demanding that Russia admit defeat, although it dominates the battlefield, among other things, he said. Then there are the hubristically delusional. Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Knighton, the chief of the Royal Air Force, told an Air Chiefs conference in London yesterday that in the wake of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, so-called, quote, what we need to communicate so that our adversaries comprehend that we have credible capability is that we're ready to fly and fight and that they will lose, he said. 2 days after the Vilnius summit, the International Schiller Institute held a conference on the verge of a new world war. European nations must cooperate with the global South. Some 14 nations attended the wide-ranging conference, including representatives from the United States. One of the speakers at the conference was Diane Sayre, independent candidate for the United States Senate in the state of New York, and she joins us here today. Diane, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so you're just back from Europe and various discussions that happened over there. Why don't you give us an impression both of what happened at the conference, but also how the people at the conference saw the events that were happening in Europe, and what their response was.
Well, I think first of all, what Helga Zepp-LaRouche stressed about this in a discussion I had yesterday was the importance of the speakers on the first panel. She, of course, giving the keynote address, which was a wide-ranging strategic overview, but also emphasis on certain cultural questions. Very important because the world is really, the West in particular, is an existential crisis. We are at the end of a rotten British colonial system and a new system is emerging. And the question is, will that new system, very much along the lines as envisioned by Lyndon LaRouche in the 70s and 80s after World War II, even earlier, will that be allowed to come into existence relatively unmolested? I would say it's being molested right now. Or are they going to resort to thermonuclear war because that's the only way to stop 6 billion plus people who are moving in this new direction? So you had, following her, the ambassador from China to France. You had a high-level Russian counselor who is the Russian representative to the European Union, and you had a journalist from India. So you had 3 major nations represented, in the case of China and Russia, by an extremely high level, which is very important because in the West, thanks to our controlled news media, people don't get to consider how the world looks from the perspective of others than, say, here in the United States, where I have to say we only represent about 4% of the world's population, but somehow we are supposed to believe that we can make the rules for everybody. And not even we, I would say, because I think most Americans don't agree with this, but there's a ruling elite with a British ideology that thinks they can impose their view on the rest of the world in a very arbitrary fashion, sort of like saying it's arbitrary. You can choose your gender and various other things. You can choose gravity doesn't exist. So the majority of the world is rejecting that. And actually, in spite of the insanity and horror being unleashed by the NATO partnership, many people on the planet are actually rather optimistic, with the caveat that they are aware that we're in great danger. So the conference brought together these representatives and then many others. There was a panel at the end on the question of science, the question of LaRouche's approach to physical economy, the question of energy flux density. I thought that was an extremely important addition, because you really can't have peace unless mankind brings its policies into harmony with universal principles.
I have a question for you, Diane, that you've been emphasizing in your independent candidacy for the United States Senate, John F. Kennedy's American University speech, in which he would offer a very clear way of collaborating with the Soviet Union on a new approach, kind of, if you will, new architecture of peace. What did you find was the view among the various nations, people that you talked to, about the United States? And what did they think about this approach that you were suggesting?
Well, I think, and Helga keeps saying it, but Americans have to really consider the world is looking for signs of intelligent life in the United States. They are aware, and the Russians have said as much, that there is a difference between the policy of the government and the view of the majority of the American people, as evidenced by the fact that we have two major presidential candidates, a Republican and a Democrat, nominally, both rejected by their parties, I would say, but who are both strongly anti-war, both calling to an end for this proxy war against Russia through Ukraine. But I think the world is wondering, can that view, can that more rational view of American policy be made to be the dominant view? And I think that remains an open question. That's why what we do is so important.
I know you have to get going, Diane, and I want to thank you for being here. Is there anything that you'd like to say in addition to what you've said so far? I know we have, by the way, on August 6th, there's going to be a major action in New York City that you're participating in, I believe.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the participation of myself personally, but or where I will be, because there's many actions around the world on that day. But in New York City, there will be an event near the United Nations, and I think it will reflect what we saw at the Rage Against the War Machine, which is a broad coalition of so-called right and left, many people who are saying we're going to put our differences aside, because if we don't survive, if we don't change this policy, we have nothing. And what I would say is that Americans have to carefully consider how we have been divided based on single issues, obsessions about this or that minor matter. And you should really consider the fact that the next few days or weeks could be the last if we don't change this. The policy, and I'm sure it'll be developed more today in terms of what's happening, but the cluster bombs are already on the ground in Ukraine. We have sent apparently 3,000 armored something or other troops to Romania and Lithuania. There seems to be no limit, no stop to what the NATO alliance is willing to do. And that is extremely dangerous. And that is why we must make our voices heard. No one can afford to sit on the sidelines, sit on the couch, sit on your hands, close your mouth. Jose Vega has called for action in 435 congressional districts. I think that is urgent. We have to create such a clamor that the world hears, and that our so-called representatives, our elected representatives, are forced to represent our view.
Thank you very much, Diane. You've just all heard from Diane Sayre, an independent candidate for the United States Senate, New York State. I want to thank you very much. Be talking to you soon.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And I want to also just let people know that what we're talking about is an action which is going to be going on Sunday, August 6th. It's actually international. It's being held by Humanity for Peace. So it's actually an international day of action, same day as the bombing of Hiroshima back in 1945. And there'll be much more said about this during the course of the next weeks. on our broadcast.
So I think, in light of the fact that, this was a few days before the NATO summit, as you say, we had an incredibly important number of guest speakers addressing the strategic situation. And given the fact that the Western media, the mainstream media, has become so absolutely streamlined that you never find out what the other side is saying, it was extremely important that we had actually a very, I would say, balanced representation of representatives of the different countries. So we had the Chinese ambassador to Paris. His name is Lu Shaye. He's a fairly important intellectual and thinker. Then we had the Russian representative to the European Union, the Minister Council in Strasbourg, Mr. Subbotin. Then we had an important Indian author and journalist, Mr. Mishra. We had the former Secretary of State of the Economic Ministry of Italy, Michele Geraci, who is famous to have been the author of the Memorandum of Understanding between China and Italy on the Belt and Road Initiative. And then we had Dr. Lemke, who is the editor of the Compass magazine and representative of a whole bunch of organizations from the former GDR, from East Germany. And finally, Alain Corobès, who is a retired colonel and advisor to many official places in the French military, French institutions otherwise. So just by the diversity of personalities from these different countries, you could get a view on the strategic situation from completely different points of views. And I think this is always important, because it's not that we, just by inviting somebody from China or from Russia or from India, does not necessarily mean that we take the view of these countries or these people. But it is extremely important for people to develop their own independent judgment on what to make out of the present strategic situation or this or that issue, by being able to shift in your mind to take the position of the other side. Nowadays you have a situation where, if you quote somebody from Russia, you are immediately blasted to be a Putin agent. Or if you take the view of somebody or report about the view of somebody from China, you are in danger of immediately being named a Chinese agent. While the one lesson from diplomacy and statecraft and the entire history is that you have to be able to put yourselves in the shoes of the other to understand the interest of the other, because never was there a peace agreement which did not take into account the interest of the other. So many people expressed complete astonishment, first of all, about the extreme high level of the speakers, then the absolute high level of discussion. And by listening to, representatives from these different countries in the original tone, rather than just reading quotes or having, short statements mentioned somewhere, it is actually possible to see the strategic reality as it is. And so, obviously one extremely important point of concern was the war danger. And, one underlying subject of the conference was the proposal, which has been promoted by the Schiller Institute since the war in Ukraine broke out. And that is the idea that we absolutely have to move away from geopolitics. And we have to establish a new international security and development architecture in order to, basically come up with solutions to end the war. Now, unfortunately, the NATO summit, which took place subsequently, 3 days later, made very clear why the approach of our conference is so important, because despite all kinds of people talking in Vilnius, there was not one shred of an attempt to go for a diplomatic solution. Just, different, versions of how to build up Ukraine militarily. Should Ukraine be offered an invitation or a timeline to enter NATO or not? Essentially what came out of it was the determination to go for a massive military buildup of Ukraine, make Ukraine even the factory of weapons, for eternity to come. So I think that our conference clearly is a counterpole in the approach. And I think that was reflected by, people expressing extreme happiness. And, in a certain sense, one argument which was mentioned by several people is, to come to a conference and then hear people from so many countries and so many political backgrounds, and all speak for peace, all speak for, go to a more human phase in the history of mankind, was such a relief, because, over the years of the pandemic, people were sitting mostly at home, feeling isolated. And so to actually hear that there is a whole other world out there was an extreme sign of relief, and people were absolutely enthusiastic.
Yeah, what you're saying is very much like what President Kennedy said in his American University speech, which is, if you want to have peace with the Soviet Union, you should consider what the world looks like from their perspective. Otherwise, you can't consider anything. I was struck by a couple of things. One was the speaker from India mentioning how India really is trying to hold itself as a neutral party, because being an American, when Modi came here, it was clear to me they were giving him the red carpet treatment, and he was having big dinners, and he unfortunately had to have dinner with Kamala Harris and Tony Blinken, I think. I guess he kept his food down. But he made a point to call Putin after that visit, which I think was very important. The other comment, and I'd like you to say more about this as well, from Colonel Corvez, was he had just come from a conference in Iran, which had been attended by 40 different nations. And I think one thing certainly many Americans are not aware of is that the global South, this block of nations that's been kept out or declared less than sovereign, is really asserting their identity and their sovereignty. It's a completely new dynamic in the world. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, that is definitely the case, because when the G7 meeting recently, a couple of weeks ago, occurred in Hiroshima, of all places in Japan, the G7 leaders, according to some press reports, said, we have to urgently talk to the leaders of the global South, because they have not joined the camp of democracy. They have not condemned Russia for the alleged unprovoked war of aggression in Ukraine. Why is that? We have to urgently talk to them. Now, the reality is that it is the arrogance of power of the Western establishments that they have not noticed that, all the policies of NATO and the West have completely boomeranged. They have caused a tremendous blowback, because, when the sanctions were declared against Russia, which was supposed to bankrupt Russia in the short term, well, that did not happen. The Russian economy now is doing very well. They had a growth of 5.4% in May, not exactly a bankruptcy, but more importantly, the countries of the global South, they saw that, and they saw how the United States basically stole the assets of Russia, more than $300 billion. And they said, wait a second, maybe if you put your assets in dollar, it's not so safe. Then the same happened with Afghanistan, $9 billion at a point when that country was about to starve. So the countries of the global South started to say it is no longer safe to trade in dollars, and they started to trade in their national currencies. And there is now a gigantic, quote, de-dollarization going on, basically also because naturally countries in the South have observed the banking crisis, both in the United States and also in Switzerland. And so there is now a huge counter-reaction by going for an own currency. A new international currency, which is not based on monetary values, but it's going to be based on physical values. This is an idea which was promoted by Lyndon LaRouche, my late husband, many years ago, who wrote an extremely important article called Trade Without Currency, which develops this idea that you have to, if you create a new stable currency, it has to be based on physical assets, on raw materials, gold being one of them, but also other raw materials. And that's exactly what is being now negotiated among the countries of the global South and Russia and China. And, you know, given the fact that the Western financial system is still, you know, as fragile as it was a couple of months ago when the banking crisis was going on in full, you know, the remedy would be not to say these countries of the global South are against the dollar, but to basically say that the United States should take the same protective measures, namely by reintroducing the Glass-Steagall banking separation, and that way cushion the currency against the casino economy excesses, and that way, you know, prevent that the eventual crash of the 2 quadrillion outstanding derivative debt could come out, you know, in a big blowout of the entire system. So there's a lot of things which, you know, people are not being told in the right way. So that was a very important point of discussion as well. But more in general, you know, the countries of the global South, because of the 10 years of collaboration with the Belt and Road Initiative, have really developed a completely new self-conscience. They have received for the first time real economic development, corridors, railways. You know, I was just thinking, you know, the Laos Kunming fast railway system has been opened, and one of the participants, Michele Geraci, was recently traveling with that railway, and he had a little video and he showed it how fast the train is going in China, where the tracks are built very well, then how it is going in Laos, also extremely well, and then how slowly the continuation of the train goes, for example, in Thailand and some other places. But people got a very clear idea of what a tremendous leap forward it is to have a fast train system. And Laos just happens to be the country in which the most cluster bombs were thrown more than 50 years ago by the United States. And I think that shows you the difference, you know, either you throw cluster bombs or you build railways. And I think that that is the choice where the so-called developing countries are clearly choosing the road of development.
Thanks. I know you have to leave, but I just have one more question, because, of course, you founded the Schiller Institute. In your speech, you spoke about Schiller's play Don Carlos, and then it turned out another speaker, Liliana Gorini, also mentioned Don Carlos. And I was wondering why you think Schiller is important, and how could it be that the two of you came up with this same drama by Schiller?
Well, Liliana, obviously, because Verdi is the national composer of Italy, and Verdi chose many libretti from Schiller and set them to music in the form of operas. And, you know, the subject of Don Carlos, I thought, you know, was very fitting because, you know, Philip II was ruling over the empire where the sun never sets. That was said at the time about the Spanish Empire. And, then the whole scene with Marquis of Posa is the confrontation between the king of a suppressive kingdom, which is basically keeping peace by suppressing the people and keeping everybody down. And then Marquis of Posa, sort of in the dialogue with him, takes the matter of humanity as a whole. And it's a very fitting situation, because do you want to keep power just to keep power, or do you do politics because you are concerned about the happiness of people? So I thought that this was a very fitting metaphor, so to speak, to describe what the real battle of the present time is all about. So I hope that this Verdi, Schiller, and Schiller as such, will inspire people to actually read this work, because if there was one author who was a master of statecraft, it was Friedrich Schiller, who actually said that the biggest piece of art is the creation of political freedom. And I think that that is very, very true.
Well, thanks very much. I think that's very important for people to remember. Is there anything else you would like to say to people here in the United States about what we could and should be doing?
Well, I think, the people of the United States must make their voice heard. I think that is probably the most strategically important factor, because we are so much on the verge of World War III, and the way how the Ukraine war evolves now, there's the talk about sending F-16 fighter jets. The Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has just come out and said that given the fact that these fighter jets, F-16, can be equipped with nuclear bombs, that whenever from now on the Russians will see such a fighter jet over the territory of Ukraine, they have to assume that it could have a nuclear bomb, and it puts the whole thing into a completely different category. Now that should get everybody have a shudder down their back, or shiver, or whatever, because we are so close to the possible catastrophe of a nuclear war that it does require the people of the United States to clearly say that they do not want to go in this direction. Now, fortunately, it looks like there will be two candidates who have expressed their opposition to the confrontation with Russia. Unfortunately, not entirely with China in the case of Trump, but you have Trump on the Republican side, and you have Robert Kennedy Jr. on the Democratic side. And I think that if you then take the heroic campaign of Diane Sare for Senate, I think you have voices who can actually completely change the United States and turn the United States back into a force of goodness in the world. And to be part of that, that should be the most noble desire of every patriotic American at this point.